Assalamu alaikum everyone and good evening. Thank you for those of us who are joining us live and who are streaming online. My name is Syed Ammar Mahdi. I am a computer science graduate from Habib University and I am an amateur mycologist. In today's talk, we are going to talk about mushrooms and fungi. And as you can see from the title of the talk, we will talk about this thing called mycelium. What exactly is mycelium? Mycelium is the main fungal organism from which the mushroom comes, right? So you can think of it like this. If you see a tree and from the tree the fruit comes like an apple tree, the mycelium is basically the main tree of the mushroom. And from the mycelium is what the mushroom actually comes. So we will see that in more detail when we see how the life cycle of the mushroom works. But for now, I will just break down what this lecture will be about. We will start a little bit about talking about what mushrooms are, how they have impacted us throughout culture and folklore, where we see them. And then we will move on to how we can cultivate mushrooms, how mushroom farming works, and how we can use these techniques to grow mushrooms in our own homes. Once that is done, we will talk about some pointers for taking pictures of mushrooms in the wild, how we can basically photograph them for identification, some do's and don'ts of mushroom hunting, and when and where we can find these mushrooms. And finally, in the last portion of the talk, we will talk about some medicinal uses of mushrooms and where the research is taking us these days on what the latest medical effects are of mushrooms. Okay, so let's just start the lecture. So here we go, mushrooms and mycelium, the hidden world of fungi. So obviously you all know who this is. I did the same lecture with the children and they were very excited to answer Santa Claus when they saw him on screen. But we all know who Santa Claus is, right? It's a very popular figure throughout our culture. But do we know what this is? You might have seen this mushroom before in your life. Yes, this is a mushroom called Amanita muscaria, also known as the fly agaric mushroom. This is one of the most popular and recognizable mushrooms on the planet. You have no doubt seen this mushroom or some form of it somewhere before. You might have played the Mario video games and you've seen this little character that pops up. It's supposed to give you an extra life within the game. This is that same mushroom, Amanita. In fact, I think it's the same mushroom which is drawn here, or it might be a different mushroom. But this is a very popular mushroom and we see it time and time again. So these mushrooms have typically been associated with what are called fairies or gnomes, elves, these kind of spirits and creatures. And they have long since fascinated humanity and they show up time and time again throughout and are present in our culture. This is what's called a fairy ring, right? So this is a formulation of mushrooms that occurs naturally in the wild, and they will take this kind of formation where they form these mysterious circles. Why do these fairy rings form? It's because when the mycelium, it actually grows, it grows radially outward, right? So what do I mean by that is, let's say that if there is a mushroom mycelium, which is basically a single cell organism, right? So this is important. A mycelium is only a single cell organism. It's just one cell, and that one cell we see when it multiplies and it grows, it forms these thin, wispy white filaments. It looks something like this, right? You might have seen mycelium. If you leave a piece of bread out for a few days and it gets moldy, that white thing that covers on top of it, or it could be gray, that is the mycelium of a fungus. In that case, it's the mycelium of mold, not the mycelium of mushrooms. I'm talking about the mycelium of mushrooms here. So what usually happens is that when this mycelium grows outwards in this direction from one point, it will grow radially outward. So it forms a circle. And once it's done growing, it's like basically the circular thing, and at the end, where it stops growing, you will see all these mushrooms pop up. So these are what are called fairy rings. In ancient times, people would see them and they would say that this is somehow a circle, you step inside to the circle, you go into another world. Of course, there's no scientific basis for these claims, right? This is just folklore, but just the name fairy ring should suggest that fungi have long been associated with these mystical kind of creatures, and they have fascinated us throughout our culture. So, like I said, I showed you a picture of Santa Claus at the start, and then I showed you this mushroom. So there is a lot of evidence which suggests that the entire legend of Santa Claus may have come from this mushroom, Amanita muscaria. And that's quite fascinating, because when we think of Santa Claus, we would think, normally we think of it as a person, but not a mushroom. So this mushroom, Amanita, it has certain hallucinogenic properties, and when people eat it, they see these kind of strange dreams. It puts them in a sleep, and they see these very vivid dreams, which can cause imagery like the flying reindeer, another symbol of Christmas, and the reindeer is also associated with Santa Claus, as we know. So that's another connection that might be associated with this mushroom. We do not know for sure if Santa Claus is entirely based on the Amanita, but there is some compelling evidence which makes us consider that this is at least one plausible theory. And of course, if you guys have played the video game The Last of Us, and you've seen the zombies that come in The Last of Us, right? So what happens in that video game, the world is overtaken by zombies, and these zombies basically come from this fungus which infects people, and once it's done infecting people, it takes over their brains, and then the person becomes a zombie, right? So this is actually based on a real organism. The name of this mushroom is Cordyceps. It's also a medical mushroom, and it's used for improving your lung circulation. In fact, people have been researching Cordyceps for improving lung capacity for people who have been affected by COVID or other respiratory diseases. But in the wild, one species of Cordyceps is also known as the zombie mushroom, because what it does is it infects these insects, like this wasp. It will take over it. The mycelium will grow inside the body of this insect, and then it will parasitically take over the host's brain. So even though this wasp is dead, or this spider, this is a spider by the way, this spider is dead or this wasp is dead, what the mushroom does is it hijacks the central nervous system and the brains of these creatures, and then it makes them move. So even though these animals are dead, their bodies are moving, and then they turn into zombies. So the Cordyceps mushroom did inspire this zombie. That's another example of where we find them in popular culture. But now let's go back a bit. This is a modern video game, right? Let's go back a bit. This is a several thousand-year-old drawing found in the, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, Tassili Najir rock caves. These are caves in Algeria in the Sahara Desert, and these are thousands of years old. This might be even older than civilization and writing itself. But we see that this is a picture of a shaman. The name of this painting is called the Bee Shaman. This is a man who is covered head to toe in some kind of mushrooms, and he's doing some kind of a ritual dance, right? And this is found in a cave which predates the time of writing itself. So mushrooms have been around in our species, and we have been using them before civilization existed. People had different use for them. Some people use them as medicine. Some people use them as other visionary substances during these religious rituals. That's what these shamans did. And nowadays we're discovering that these same mushrooms that these people were using in these traditional kind of rituals as shamans, modern science is also proving that they have some useful medical properties. But we'll come to that at the end of the lecture. Similarly, we see this very ancient rock carving. This is depicting the legend of Demeter and Persephone. Demeter and Persephone are two figures in Greek legend, if you guys are aware of that. As the legend goes, Persephone was the daughter of Demeter, who was, and her father was Zeus. So Zeus was the leader of the pantheon of the Greek gods, right? Zeus had originally planned to marry her off to her brother Hades, his brother Hades, which is her uncle. She did not agree to the match, and then she was abducted and taken to the underworld, right? This is the legend that the Greeks give, that this is how winter comes, that Persephone is taken away from her mother for 4 months, and in these 4 months we see the cold winter season come, and the crops die, and we don't have any life. So it comes from that legend, and you can see there's actually what people speculate a mushroom which is connected to this legend as well. So that's another connection. And we see in these very ancient church drawings also, this is supposedly Jesus Christ depicted with these mushrooms. And we have a very old 13th century chapel painting of Adam and Eve in, the legend of Adam and Eve in the garden, right? So some people have speculated that the forbidden fruit that Adam and Eve ate was a mushroom, not an apple. I don't know where the apple comes from, but this is becoming a more plausible theory in recent times. And people are starting to speculate that maybe the fruit from the tree of knowledge was actually the fruit of a mushroom. Mushrooms are actually a kind of fruit, by the way, which also we'll see a bit more in detail. This was a book called The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, written by an author called John Allegro, right? So he's originally one of the author who translated the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are a very ancient form of archaeological evidence that goes back to ancient civilization. And he wrote in his book, there was a hypothesis that originally the religion of Christianity was a mushroom cult. And this was a very controversial book. He was a respectable historian before this. After he published this book, he was basically ostracized from the academic community. No one would take him seriously. People were not he basically ended his entire academic career as a serious historian because he speculated that Christianity was originally a mushroom religion. There is quite a bit of interesting evidence in this book though, especially these pictures that I showed you before of Jesus Christ often shown with some kind of mushroom. So there is some connection there. We can't say for sure to what extent this book is true, but it was a very controversial book at the time that it was released. And finally, we see these ancient mushroom stones. These have been found in North America. So before the Spanish came in parts of Mexico, there were these mushroom stones which were connected to these fertility cults. The people at the time used to consume these mushrooms, and it was a part of religious ritual for them. But when the Spanish came and they spread the Catholic faith to this place, they decried the practice of eating mushrooms as a satanic activity, and then subsequently they continued to destroy all evidences of mushroom used as a sacrament. That's why most of these mushroom stones were destroyed, but some of them still survived despite the Catholic Inquisition. And these date back to the Aztec period, and most of them are also used as grinding the sacraments. The sacraments in this case are the fungi that people use in these rituals, right? So far we've just seen a basic glimpse of how mushrooms and fungi have played a role throughout human history, in human culture, and have captured different parts of our imagination. So having set that context, let's actually move on to what mycelium is, right? So the kingdom of fungi is one of the 5 main kingdoms of life, right? Along with the kingdom of bacteria, the kingdom of animals, the kingdom of plants. So fungi is actually a separate kingdom entirely. Fungi are not a kind of plant. You might see a mushroom, let's say on a pizza, and you will think that this is a kind of vegetable. It's not a vegetable, and it's not even an animal. It's something else entirely. If you see a close-up of a mushroom cell under a microscope, it actually quite resembles an animal cell more than it resembles a plant cell. That's why people say that mushrooms typically have a meaty taste, right? They taste like meat. That's the word that people use most often to describe the umami flavor that mushrooms have. And the reason for that may have to do with the fact that they are more closely related to animals than they are to plants. In fact, the most recent common ancestor of animals and fungi was estimated to have lived 1.6 million years ago. Over time, as we evolved, animals developed separately and fungi developed separately, but at one point, animals and fungi were the same. That's why mushrooms are quite similar to human beings, and they're more similar to human beings than they are to plants, is what I mean to say. Okay, I got this visual from the video by After School. It's a great video. You should check it out. This is basically the life cycle of a mushroom. So a mushroom starts with what are called spores. Spores are basically analogous to seeds, but not exactly. So to grow a plant, you need a seed. You plant that seed in the ground, and from that you get a mushroom. The equivalent for that for a mushroom is what's called a spore. So the spores are microscopic, right? and they're very tiny. So what happens is that when the mushroom fully grows, the wind carries these millions of spores far away, and they remain airborne and suspended until they find something that they can grow on, and then the spores germinate. Once they germinate, they form this mycelium. The mycelium continues to grow until it's fully covered a food source or it's ready to fruit, right? When it's ready to fruit, it forms what's known as a pinhead, which then turns into a mushroom. The mushroom releases more spores, and then the cycle continues again. So this word is quite interesting, a fruit body. A mushroom is actually the fruiting body of a mycelium. It's a type of fruit, just not a fruit which comes from a plant, but a kind of fruit which comes from a fungus, right? Okay. Now that you know how the life cycle of the mushroom works, I will quickly go into cultivation of mushrooms. So to cultivate mushrooms, most typically, it's not as straightforward as growing a plant, right? If you want to grow a plant, all you'll need is one seed. You can plant it in the earth, and it's quite straightforward. With a mushroom, we're not dealing with just a macroscopic thing like a seed, we're dealing with microscopic particles. That's why it's quite difficult to grow mushrooms. You need complicated lab equipment to do most of the work that's required to grow them. So this is something called a laminar flow hood. You need this laminar flow hood to work with cultures in microbiology. So if you've seen any kind of culture which is growing on a petri dish, we work on petri dishes because you need some kind of medium that can help the mycelium grow, because otherwise, if it does not have a clean thing to grow on, a clean medium or surface, there are millions of spores all around us. Even right now, as we are breathing, there are millions of billions of spores of different kind of fungi or mold species that are just in the air. So to grow a specific one species from those millions of spores, you're going to need a clean environment. You need a place where there is no other kind of mold spores in the air, so you can isolate just the organism that you want to grow. So that's why we use something called a laminar flow hood. You will find these in biological labs. Unfortunately, this piece of equipment is quite expensive. This costs several lakhs of rupees just for one laminar flow hood. You will find these in bio labs or maybe some mushroom farms, but they're quite hard to find for a normal person. So similarly, you also have an autoclave, right? It's called. Why do we need this autoclave? We need this before we can grow any mycelium or any kind of other microorganism. We need a completely sterile environment. And to ensure that sterile environment, we use an autoclave. The autoclave will cook something in steam for, let's say, 1 hour. And in that time, it will kill all the other organisms that are present in that substrate. So nothing else will grow on that medium. Only the thing you want to grow, the mycelium, will be able to grow. This works similarly to if you have ever seen any canned food. What they do is when you cook the food and you put it in a can, then you put it on in a steamer for 1 hour or something. That will kill any other organism. So this is how a canned food can stay fresh for many years even after it has been cooked, because the sterilization, steam sterilization, will kill all other microorganisms present, so it won't be able to rot. We use a similar process in the growing of mushrooms. But then again, we don't have a laminar flow hood and we don't have an autoclave. So what can we do? Let's say I want to grow mushrooms at home. Luckily, there are some alternatives that I can use in my home, which will ensure that I do not have to use an expensive piece of lab equipment. I can also grow the same mushroom at my home using not state-of-the-art, but homemade substitutes for these state-of-the-art lab equipment, right? So you can see in this table, I've just quickly written down what some of these are. So instead of an autoclave in a lab, you can use a pressure cooker at home. Instead of a flow hood, you can use a still air box. Instead of petri dishes, you can use these plastic containers, which I will show you. And finally, you can, instead of using the expensive lab-grade agar, you can also use agar that's available in the market. What is agar, by the way? You'll see this word quite a bit, so let me just say, agar is a kind of vegan gelatin. It's vegan because it comes from a seaweed. It does not, normally gelatin comes from the bones of animals, but in this case it comes from a seaweed, so it's vegan. People use it for cooking, but more importantly in science, we use agar as a medium. So anything that's growing, if you see a petri dish, usually it has agar with it. The agar will act as the medium on which the mycelium grows. And agar is also used for growing bacteria and other lab cultures. If you go for any kind of lab test and they take your blood or urine sample, chances are they will try to grow out your blood or your urine on the agar to see if there's any harmful bacteria present. And that's how they test you for a lot of diseases. So let's see. Okay, this is an overall general view of how the mushroom farming process works. This is quite complicated, so let's just break it down step by step. Yeah, start with this. So you need a piece of mycelium. This is a live mushroom, and what they're doing is they're cloning the mycelium from the tissue. So there's two ways that you can start a fresh mycelium culture. The first way is through spores, and the second way is through live tissue, right? So you have two options. Your first option, you start fresh from a spore. And your second option is you use live tissue. So what's the difference between these two? When you start from spore, you need a spore print or a spore swab. Basically, any sample, this is a spore print. So what happens is that if you take a cap of a mushroom, when it's fully mature, it will release some spores and those drop. If you just put a piece of paper or some foil underneath the mushroom cap, it will drop all its spore in what's called a spore print. Spore prints are also used to uniquely identify mushrooms. That's how some people say that we have X mushroom instead of Y mushroom. You use a spore print. But the spore print is also used to germinate fresh mycelium. So you have two options. You can either use a living mushroom and you clone a piece of tissue from that mushroom to get a culture, or you can start fresh from a spore, right? So after your agar medium is ready, you can see that they're pouring the agar. I'll also show you a picture of this later on, so don't worry. They're pouring the agar. Once your agar is ready, you can germinate spores, or you can use live tissue to clone that. And once that's ready, you inoculate some grain. The grain has been already sterilized in our pressure cooker or our autoclave. This will help ensure that there are no contaminations, so we only have the mycelium that we want to grow. And obviously, once you have your grain spawn, anything is possible. So depending on the species of mushroom you're using, some mushrooms like reishi prefer to grow on logs, so you need some kind of stump culture or log culture. Other mushrooms like oyster mushrooms are quite easy to grow on anything like straw, chara, or they can even grow on toilet paper. You can grow them. That's how I grew them at home, basically. So depending on which mushroom you're using, you have all these different methods like a wall culture, a column culture, a bag culture, and you can farm them. But the main thing you need is your spawn, right? So instead of, you use your spawn and you mix it with something that's called a substrate. Your substrate is just the medium in which you're growing your mushrooms, right? So there's two things. There's spawn and then there's substrate. Spawn will be the thing that the mycelium eats and colonizes, which in our case, it was the grain. It colonizes jar of grain. And the substrate is the medium in which it will grow on. It could be wood, it could be soil, it could be something else, right? So this is how I grew the oyster mushrooms at home. I got some mushrooms from Itwar Bazaar, the weekly Sunday market, and I was able to take a piece of tissue from inside the mushroom and I cloned it. In a few days, there was a small white growth on my agar, and this was the mycelium from this tissue culture. So this is one method that we can make agar at home. You can see this thing in the middle. That's the agar powder. And then I have some other things with me. These are plastic containers. And these plastic containers, you might have seen them before. If you order takeout food, they're usually found with the sauce. We use these kind of containers because they're small and they're quite cheap. You can also recycle them. And they're made of this plastic called PP5 plastic, right? So PP5 plastic is a special type of plastic which is safe for microwave use. You can put it in an autoclave, you can put it in steam, it will not melt. So what I did was I took these are just my measuring tools, by the way. You don't need to have all of this. You don't need to have, for example, these glass bottles. You can use anything else for that. But you need a gram scale so you can measure out which agar recipe you're using. Once you measure out your ingredients, you mix them and then you pour them like this in these containers, right? And once they've cooled down, they're ready to put in an autoclave. So I told you before that instead of an autoclave, you can use a pressure cooker. This is how you can do that. At home, you just take a pressure cooker, you put a steam rack on the bottom of it, and you wrap your agar dishes in the aluminum foil. The aluminum foil is important because it will prevent any water from going inside and disrupting the agar during the sterilization process. So you wrap these agar plates completely in this, you fill this with water, and then you put the pressure cooker on heat. Once the heat is high enough and there's sufficient steam that is built inside the pressure cooker, you will have to wait a fixed amount of time to put on the weight. After putting on the weight, you will have to pressure cook it usually at 15 psi. PSI is a unit for pressure, it stands for pounds per square inch. So depending on the recipe you have, you can use, you have different autoclave times. So let's say if I'm making brown rice flour agar, that's one recipe which is commonly used. I will have to autoclave it for 15 minutes. So for 15 minutes, when my pressure cooker comes on steam and the weight on top starts to rattle, that's how long it will take, and I will have to put this inside the steam. Once that cycle finishes and it comes off the heat, the agar is ready to use. So I will take it out of my pressure cooker again. And now what has happened is that during that steam cycle, any other microorganism that was present on this has died. So nothing survives. This is a completely clean and sterile medium for us. Even if you leave this thing for months, nothing will grow in it. It will be completely clean if it has been sterilized, because all the microorganisms inside it have died out and now it's airtight, so there is no way of any other spore or bacteria or fungus of getting inside. So I showed you this picture of the mycelium I cloned, right? This is it, from the live tissue. Just a few days later, you can see that there was some growth inside this. This whole thing turned white. It turns white because the mycelium eats the food color as well. It uses that, it converts as a sugar, and then it uses that as a food source. And once it's grown white, you can see some kind of these weird structures that are forming inside of this. These structures are what are called the pins. So if you remember in the diagram I showed you before, the pins are basically the baby mushrooms which form into mushrooms, right? So what you're seeing inside this thing, this weird looking tentacle, is actually an oyster mushroom. So it's starting to grow inside the container. Obviously there's another step after this. I have to transfer this to grain again, like a grain like bajra, wheat or oats, and then I can use that as my spawn. But in this case, it's only growing inside of the agar, so these fruiting bodies start to form, which you can again clone to make a new culture. I did not do that here, but I'm just showing you to show you what it looks like. Okay, the same oyster mycelium from my different cultures, and this was basically me starting the cloning process from a piece of a live mushroom I found. I could have gone the other way. I could have used a spore print or a spore swab instead, and the results would have been the same. This method is just more convenient. So if you want to start farming mushrooms at home, you can just go to the supermarket, buy any mushroom, and clone a small piece of that on your agar, and then you will have the same culture ready. This was for our research that I did as part of my thesis. So we were using mycelium to see what its network properties are like. We were seeing how similar it is to a slime mold, and we used some mathematical measures for that. I won't get too much into my research, but part of our research also involved growing these oyster mushroom mycelium in the lab. So for that, we used some lab equipment. You can see that I showed you one method of making agar. That was the method I showed you was called Nopoor or prepoor agar. This is an easy method for someone who's just starting to grow mushrooms for the first time. The alternate method to that people usually use in a professional lab setting is pouring the agar. You can see that these are the petri dishes that we use in the lab, and you're using these conical flasks. These flasks are also pressure sterilized, and then you're pouring the agar inside of that. And you're using this flame so that there's a sterile medium to ensure that no microorganism survives, right? So in a radius around this flame, there's actually a clean area for us, and because of the fire, because of the heat, it kills all other microorganisms, which ensures that this pouring process itself is clean. So that when we are pouring the agar on the dish, no spore or no microparticle can come on our agar, which will later germinate and cause contamination. This is how they usually do it in the lab, but as I showed you, you can also do it at your home. These pictures I showed you are all from my kitchen, right? So I did this inside of my kitchen. I did not use a lab for this, but you can also do it inside of a lab, whatever is more convenient for you. This is me sterilizing a scalpel. So before you take any transfers of a mycelium, right, if we go back to this, right, you can see that this is the scalpel that they're using. So you use a scalpel and you sterilize it using a flame so that it's clean. If you put it in a lighter, in a flame for 15 seconds, it will kill any bacteria or any other spores that are present on the scalpel surface itself. And once the scalpel is clean, you can cut off a piece from the agar and then use that cut off piece and transfer it to a new dish. And that's how you get the growth. So yeah, this is me sterilizing the scalpel. These are just some shots of me doing the lab work. And this was the mycelium that we got. It's not a very good picture. I apologize for that. But you can see that this small white wispy thing is growing out from this wedge. This is the wedge that we transferred from a previous agar dish, and it got us this mycelium. Again, this small wedge that you cut out and you transfer it to a new dish. This is the grain spawn that we were talking about. So once you have a clean culture, you can transfer it to grain. In this case, this was our grain. It was bajra. So I took some bajra, and bajra is pearl millet, by the way. It's a grain which is local to Pakistan and India. So you just take some cooked bajra and then you put it in a jar. You pressure sterilize that jar. That bajra is clean. Now what you have to do is you have to transfer some mycelium from that culture, your petri dish, onto this grain. The mycelium will eat this grain, and once it's fully colonized, it all becomes white. You can see that towards the top, this small white thing which is starting to come out of it, that is the mushroom mycelium, right? It's growing because it's colonized the entire thing. It's still searching for food, so it will start growing on the sides of the glass container. This is not a good sign, by the way. It looks a bit wet. So this usually indicates the presence of some bacteria. It means that your spawn is not clean, and during getting mushrooms, you can get some contamination. But this is not the best result, but this is just to show you what a fully colonized grain jar looks like. And again, I'm showing you different agar recipes. I use food coloring, by the way, so the food coloring makes it easier to see if you have white mycelium or if you have some other kind of contamination. Same procedure with my pressure cooker. You can see these dishes are wrapped and then they're autoclaved. And then we come to the lab setup. So I talked in the beginning that normally we use something called a flow hood, right? But a flow hood is a very expensive piece of equipment. So what can the alternatives to our flow hood be? That is something called a still air box. So a still air box is this thing that you see in front of you. This is what the amateur mycologist, someone who is a very beginner to this hobby and you don't have a lot of resources, this is what you use instead of a flow hood. So I have taken a plastic container here, and you can see that in the plastic container there are two small holes, and inside the holes you can see through the holes. So inside the holes are the small holes because you put your arms through these holes, and the still air box works on the principle of physics, right? So we don't, in a laminar flow hood, usually what happens is you have a fan which is throwing out clean air, and because of that clean air, you do not have to do anything else. You just have a clean surface in front of you. So the laminar flow hood uses this technology called HEPA, stands for high efficiency particulate something. But HEPA filters are basically very accurate in that they are 99.99% clean. So it means that whatever air is coming out of the laminar flow hood, 99.99% of it will not have any kind of other bacteria or any contaminant present. So you will have a clean surface to work with, right? But we don't have that liberty at home. So instead we use a still air box. So it's a plastic box with these holes cut into it, and what happens is that you use a room which is completely sealed off. Once the room is sealed off, there is no place, no movements, and because there's no movements and the movements are very small, the air will all settle down because of gravity, right? So once the air is completely still and it settles down, gravity causes the particles to fall down, right? So let's say these are just some mold spores suspended in the air, and this is the force of gravity which is acting on them. After a while, what will happen is that if the air in the room is completely still, there is no movement, there is no draft, the particles will all settle to the bottom. And because of the particles settling, the still air box now has some air which is completely still, but it's free from any kind of bacteria or any other contaminations which can fall on your agar. So this is what we normally use to grow our mushrooms at home. So you can see this is a picture of me working inside of it. My hands are inside the still air box and I'm manipulating the agar inside. And you have to take very small movements, because if you move too quickly and the air gets disturbed too much, you will cause some sudden air movement and the particles will instead settle on the surface of the agar. And we don't want that, right? We want that there is no foreign particle or contaminant which is growing when we are working inside of our still air box. This is some mycelium that we got in the lab. So the different colors basically represent the different recipes for mycelium. This is a different recipe. It is, I think, 3% coconut water. And the mycelium is the white thing that's growing from the middle of it. Similarly, we also have this other recipe. This was water agar, so this is just water and nothing else. And then this is 6% coconut water. So different recipes of agar have different growth rates, and different growth rates, some might be fast, some might be slow, but different mushroom species will also have different requirements. So let's say if I want to grow oyster mushrooms, I can use brown rice flour agar for that. But if I want to grow reishi mushrooms, so reishi mushrooms only grow on hardwoods in the wild. So I will have to use some kind of sawdust in my agar and mix the sawdust with this so it can mimic what the mycelium would have eaten in the wild, and we're trying to get that kind of medium. But for our purposes, for the example that I am giving you, oyster mushrooms can grow on just about any recipe. You can use pasta water. So when you cook noodles and the leftover water from the noodles, you can use that even, and the mushroom will still grow on that. And of course, we talked about contamination. Sometimes you don't get these neat little results that you get. So this is a very clean result. You can see that there's nothing else growing in the dish. It's just the white mycelium. Other times you will see that some kind of contamination you get. This is just some mold which is growing in between the agar dish, and this is not what we want, obviously. So we had to discard this because we could not get the mycelium of the oyster mushroom, but instead we got the mycelium of a mold. And in such cases, your biggest bet is to just discard the contaminated culture. Sometimes, if this is clean enough, you can still cut out a piece of it. So let's say that instead of maybe the whole thing being contaminated, if there was mycelium around this, so I could have cut out a small piece here and transferred it to a new clean dish. So this is the advantage of agar. Agar allows us to isolate the mycelium and cut it out from other contaminants or other microorganisms which we do not want to grow. And that's one of the main advantages of using agar in mycology. Since we are working with microscopic organisms, it's not the same as a plant which you can just, it's visible to the naked eye. All of these things are microscopic. So to work with a microscopic medium, you need this agar. Otherwise, you don't know if you're growing a mushroom or you're growing some other kind of mold. And so you see in the starting, I showed you this picture of my agar dish. After a while, I got these pins on it. And this was my final result. These are the oyster mushrooms that I harvested. I also cooked them and ate them, by the way. They taste a bit like chicken, not exactly, but quite meaty. And this is growing on top of a toilet paper roll. So once our grain spawn was fully colonized, here, oh my God, I have to go all the way back now. Once this is fully colonized and the mycelium has eaten it, you spawn it and you mixed it with the substrate. Once you mix it with the substrate, which in our case was toilet paper, it will fully colonize this, and once the fruiting conditions are met, that's when we get the mushrooms. So what are fruiting conditions? Fruiting conditions are these conditions which typically cause mushrooms to grow, right? So usually this can be a drop in the temperature, a change in humidity, or a changing of seasons. So most of these mushroom species, they come out after it has rained. The reason for that is that when it rains, that there is usually a temperature drop, and that temperature drop tells the mycelium that it's time to now fruit. And that fruiting, once the fruiting conditions are met, the mycelium will start to form these little pinheads. You can see these tiny pins, and once the pins fully grow, you get these mushrooms, and then you can harvest the mushrooms, and you can cook them, you can store them, you can dry them, you can do whatever. Okay, so this was just a high-level overview of how mushroom farming works. It's a bit more technical. Don't be too intimidated by this. If anyone is interested in mushroom farming, there are a lot of good channels on YouTube that you can go. You can find all the tutorials online. They will show you step by step how you can do it at home without needing much technical expertise. Why is this not? Okay. Now we move on to the next part of the talk, which is how you can take pictures of mushrooms. So mushrooms are all around us. We might not see them, but they usually appear, like I said, when it rains. These are just some examples of some mushrooms that I found in the wild. So if you guys have been hiking to the Islamabad Trail, it's a very biodiverse area as well. You will find a lot of mushroom species in the Islamabad Trail. So once you find a species, though, the most important thing that you have to do is you have to identify the species, right? If you don't identify a mushroom species, you don't know what you're dealing with, and it's not recommended to eat any mushroom unless you know exactly what mushroom species this is. So this is very important because there are some mushroom species which look like some other kind of safe, edible or medicinal mushroom, but if you go ahead and eat it, it will basically kill you because it's toxic. So I'm not a trained mycologist, I don't do my identifications by myself, but there are groups online, there are groups on Facebook. One group is mushroom identification, literally just search mushroom identification, you will find it. And on these groups, you can find experts who will identify your mushroom for you. But for them to identify a mushroom, you must first take a picture of the mushroom properly. So you can see that I photographed this mushroom. Someone told me that this mushroom is called chhatri, which means parasol in Urdu. I don't know what the local name for this mushroom is, but apparently it's poisonous. So I did not go near this. I was supposed to take a picture of the mushroom from the underside, right? So there's two things that you should keep in mind if you're taking a picture of any mushroom for identification. The first thing is that you should be able to see the gills of the mushroom. So what are the gills? If you see a mushroom, it looks something like this, right? So on the top part, you have the cap of the mushroom. And on the bottom part, you have these things. So these things are called the gills. And the gills help us uniquely identify a mushroom. So just like human beings have our thumbprints, the mushrooms have different gills which give different spore prints. So if you don't see a picture of the underside of the mushroom, I cannot say for sure what this mushroom is. So that's why you need a picture where you can see the underside, or you can see the gills clearly, right? And secondly, you should know the location and the time where you found the mushroom, right? So a lot of mushrooms do look identical, but there are some mushroom species which taxonomists have classified, and they have confirmed that this species is found only in Pakistan, or maybe it's not found in Pakistan. So that's why having the location and the time where you took the picture of the mushroom is also important. So unfortunately, I could not get an identification for this mushroom. It was found growing among the pine needles. But this was another mushroom that I found, and I got an ID for this. This is unconfirmed. But as I was walking through the trails and inside the hollow of a trunk, you would not even expect to find anything inside this. But if you look closely, you can find these mushrooms. I don't think this is an edible mushroom species, but it can be found inside the hollow of the trunk, of a tree trunk. This is in Islamabad Trail 3. Boom. And this mushroom, Formitopsis, this is also on the hiking trail. So this is what's called a polypore. Polypore. So polypores are special types of mushrooms which usually grow on the logs of these trees. So this is a polypore mushroom. Some of them are edible, not all of them are edible. Some of them are toxic, some of them are medicinal. As again, just try to identify whatever mushroom you're dealing with. So this was growing on a dead tree. There are some other mushrooms which also grow on living trees. Similarly, you can also find some other mushrooms which are growing not on the trees but on dead leaves. So this is another mushroom species I found on the grass. If you look closely, you can see the small white things which are coming out of the dead vegetation. And these are also a type of mushrooms. They're not edible exactly, but they're called xyleria, which is dead man's fingers. This is also in Islamabad Trail 3 on the hiking trail. There's another similar mushroom to this. It's called the dead man's toes. It looks quite disgusting. So you can see why it's called dead man's toes. It quite literally looks like a dead man's toes. This is not found in Islamabad. It's a picture from elsewhere, but it was interesting, so I included it. And then if you come down at the hiking trail where there was the pakoda and the chai place, and you looked in the grass after it rained, you found these species, right? And this is Candolium. I don't think this is an edible species. This might also be toxic, but you can find them growing outside when it's rained, after it's rained. And finally, this was another species I found while hiking. If you go to the hiking spot in Islamabad in Trail 3, if you walk enough, you will see a place where there's some water. At the banks of the river, near the water, you found this. Trail 5. Yeah, Trail 5. Thank you. At the bank of the river near Trail 5, you found these species. This is Marasmius. I don't know the exact name of the species, but this was what it was identified as. You can see in the picture again, I took a whole picture of the mushrooms growing around their natural habitat, but I also picked one and I took a picture of what the gills look like, right? So these gills, the underside, this is what helps the mycologist identify that this is in fact this mushroom and not something else. So you need to have a clear shot of the gills, otherwise they won't be able to identify it. And yeah, you might be concerned that maybe I'm touching this mushroom. Usually this is safe to do. The only time that a mushroom can be poisonous is usually when you ingest it, with the exception of some species, but those species are not found here. So as long as I don't eat it, it's safe. I can still touch it. Just don't try to ingest anything you don't know if this species is edible or not. So this is safe to do. You can touch the mushroom for pictures, right? Again, as I emphasized, do not try to eat any mushroom you find in the wild. There are too many imposters, there are too many species which look like something else. It might look exactly like another kind of mushroom species, but you eat it and only then you find out it's too late. So just to be on the safe side, get any mushroom identified first before you find out if it's safe to eat or not. Okay, this was just a brief video which I thought was interesting. I wanted to play it. I don't know if this will work. Okay, it won't work. But the visual that you can go and watch it is by this channel called After School, and it's quite an interesting video. They discuss many things. They talk about the Cordyceps, the zombie ant mushrooms I talked about. They go more into detail about that, and it just details how fungal intelligence works in nature, right? So you can watch this video later. If anyone's interested, I can send them a link for it. Okay, and finally, we move on towards last part of this talk, which is the medicinal uses of mushrooms, right? So I will be discussing some medical uses of these mushroom species and how they are going to help us. So we discussed how traditional medicine, right? Like you have traditional Chinese medicine, Eastern medicine, and then you have different shamans. These people have been using mushrooms for a long time for treating different kinds of diseases or different ailments. It is only now that we are just starting to use these mushrooms and we're starting to find out what are some scientific benefits for it, right? So one of these is lion's mane mushroom. This is natively found in the Asia Pacific, and it quite literally looks like a lion's mane, right? It's white, and this mushroom is actually quite delicious. I have never eaten it myself, but people say it makes a very good meat substitute, and it acts as a replacement for steak also. but it has many neurogenerative benefits, as in it can help your nerve cells grow, it can repair damaged neurons. That's why people are claiming that if for people who have Alzheimer's or dementia, if they use this mushroom, it can quite significantly improve their quality of life. And of course, we know that if you're suffering from Alzheimer's or dementia, it's quite a horrible disease, and it's usually it's caused by the degradation of your neurons and your nervous system over time. It just degrades and starts to slowly fade away. But the lion's mane mushroom can actually kind of we don't know for sure if it can prevent dementia. The research is still out on that, so we don't want to claim that it can completely prevent Alzheimer's and dementia. But there is some good evidence that it can at least improve the quality of life for people who already have it. You might have also heard of this mushroom and mushroom supplements. So what people are doing nowadays is that they want to move away from coffee and they need an alternative to caffeine. So lion's mane is also used as an alternative to caffeine in that it can be used to treat ADHD, attention deficit disorder, and other conditions which people normally treat with stimulants. So, and it also boosts your memory and cognition. So people are using it as a natural nootropic. Nootropics are basically substances which can improve the functioning of your brain and they can offer some kind of benefit. So people use the lion's mane as a natural nootropic, and there are other benefits to it which we are only just starting to uncover. But for now, the time being, the main ones which we do know of are improved cognitive functioning, improved focus, and some improvements in memory. You can also find the extract for this lion's mane mushroom. It's sold popularly in many mushroom supplement companies. Just be careful if you're ordering them in Pakistan, because a lot of places like Daraz have fake products and they will scam you. So try and get a reputable source and vendor if you're trying to order these mushrooms or their extract. This is just in one research paper that was done on the neurological activity of lion's mane, Hericium arenicus. I don't know how to pronounce that. But this is just one sample research paper. There's a growing body of scientific literature. You can find a lot of them. Just go to Google Scholar, any journal, and you will find a lot of research on lion's mane mushroom. Similar to lion's mane, we also have the reishi mushroom. This is also a mushroom which naturally grows on these logs. So people also farm reishi mushrooms commercially, by the way, but it's not that easy to grow in Pakistan, from what I know. I might be wrong, maybe it's possible, but it's not so far being grown in Pakistan. There is a huge potential for it, of reishi farming, but since mycology itself is quite new in Pakistan, there are not a lot of people who are growing medicinal or edible mushrooms. So maybe in some time that we will see some reishi farms, but from what I know, that so far there is not any farming of reishi in Pakistan. But this mushroom, the reishi mushroom, is also another medical mushroom. It can help treat fatigue, high blood pressure, and cholesterol. So unfortunately, the desi and Pakistani diets that we have, they are very high in cholesterol and other things which lead to high blood pressure, high amount of sodium. So we are looking for natural medicinal mushrooms which might offset these negative physical effects. And we see that reishi mushroom is another mushroom which might lower fatigue, it might lower blood pressure and lower cholesterol. We also have diabetes, by the way, I forgot. Lion's mane mushroom, I didn't mention it here, but it's also useful for diabetic patients because it can lower blood sugar. Like some other foods like the bitter gourd, karela, that also lowers blood sugar. But lion's mane mushroom is another food which can lower blood sugar. So that's why they're saying that diabetic patients might find it to be helpful. There's still quite a lot of research left on this. It's been traditionally used in traditional medicine for thousands of years, but the scientific research on these mushrooms is just now starting to catch up. So maybe we'll see that it can be helpful for diabetes. Maybe it's not that helpful. We don't know the full extent of it, but the initial results do look promising. Finally, we come to the psilocybe mushrooms. These are the magic mushrooms that some of you might have heard of. And these are becoming quite useful recently. So there have been a lot of clinical trials about psilocybe mushrooms at Johns Hopkins University. Johns Hopkins University is one of the leading medical research centers of the world, and they're using these mushrooms to treat people with different kinds of mental health, mental disorders, right? So people who have treatment-resistant depression, treatment-resistant depression is the kind of depression in which, let's say, if someone has clinical depression and they've been trying to get it treated and they try different antidepressants, they try some SSRI maybe, and they try 2 to 3 different medications, they go to different psychiatrists, it does not work. So some kinds of depression are the treatment-resistant depression, and there's even if you try to use some antidepressant or other psychiatric medication for it, your depression will not be cured. So there is some research which is using these psilocybe mushrooms. They contain this compound called psilocybin, and that compound has some natural antidepressant properties which can help with these disorders like bipolar disorder or BPD. BPD or borderline personality disorder, again, is there is no psychiatric drug which we know currently that works for BPD. If someone has BPD and is clinically diagnosed with it, they can be given some antidepressants, but those antidepressants only manage the comorbid symptoms of BPD like depression. It does not cure the BPD by itself. But however, these psilocybe mushrooms have some potential that they can even help these people with BPD. Similarly, people who have trauma, childhood trauma or some kind of PTSD, they can find some medical benefit with these mushrooms. So in 2008, this was the medical study that they did, is that psilocybin can occasion mystical type experiences. So this word is quite interesting, mystical experiences. So people who report these mushrooms typically report having some kind of a spiritual or some kind of mystical experience, and that experience itself is what helps them overcome their depression or their other kind of mental health disorders, right? So they did this research, and that they found out the people who were in this study were all cancer patients, and they were cancer patients who were about to die, and they were terminal patients, and because of their imminent death, they had this depression which was not going away by normal treatment. So what the Johns Hopkins team did was that they gave the psilocybin to these people, and up to 80% of the people who took part in the study, they said that this mushroom trip was one of the top 5 most significant events that they had in their lives. So top 5 significant events, what else? This included events like the birth of your first child or the death of your parents. So these are all very important life events for any of us, right? If someone's parents dies or if their first child is being born, obviously it will be a very big event for them. But the people who took these mushrooms said that it was maybe as significant as these events for them. And not only did it help them overcome their depression, but 90% of them reported that they had increased life satisfaction because of this. So the chemical mechanism for how it works is that these mushrooms contain a compound which is called psilocybin. This is where the comes from the name of psilocybe mushroom, psilocybin. So if you look at the psilocybin molecule, it looks very similar to the serotonin molecule, right? And the serotonin molecule is linked to your mental health, it's linked to your depression. So people who are depressed, usually you give them SSRIs. So SSRIs are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. These are normally the most commonly used type of drug in psychiatry that we give these antidepressants. They are SSRIs. And we give these people because it blocks the reuptake of serotonin. In simple terms, what that means is it increases the amount of serotonin you have in your brain, right? And that increased serotonin has the antidepressant effects. It reduces your depression, reduces your anxiety, and it reduces these other symptoms. But instead of using SSRIs to increase your serotonin, these psilocybin mushrooms also mimic the serotonin molecule in the brain, and they bind to the brain's serotonin receptors, which in turn causes the effects. And this is quite a different model of treatment from what we typically use in psychiatry. So normally if a person has clinical resistant depression or anxiety or any other kind of mental health disorder or mental illness, they will have to undergo therapy for a while, and while they are in that therapy, they will have to take an antidepressant every day, right? So if I start taking an antidepressant, I will have to keep taking it for a few weeks or a few months. I have to take it daily, and I cannot abruptly stop taking it because it is physically dependent. It is habit forming. And what it does is, if you are dependent on an antidepressant, you cannot stop taking it completely. You have to taper off the dosage. And it's a daily thing that you have to take, and it can have quite a lot of side effects if you try to stop it suddenly. In the case of psilocybin, you don't have to, in the clinical trials that they did, you don't have to give someone the mushroom every day. They only take it once, and just from taking it once, they can find that most, if not all of their symptoms have gone, if not improved. So there are some advantages, obviously, that are associated with these compounds. They're organic and naturally occurring, right? So this is completely organic. You don't have to use any chemical. It's not lab grown. Some people, there's a move towards more organic medicines, so they might find that advantageous. But it's also non-toxic. It has a very high LD50. LD50 is a lethal dose 50. It's the amount of a substance you need in your body for it to kill you. So psilocybin is non-toxic. It's impossible to die from it, and it's also non-addictive. So once you use a psilocybin mushroom, you cannot use it again for at least 2 weeks because it has a very high and rapidly building tolerance. This helps ensure that people don't abuse it. And some disadvantage, obviously, the biggest one is that it's still illegal in most parts of the world. In Canada, psilocybin mushrooms have recently started to become legal, and in some parts of the United States, like Oregon. So they're becoming legal precisely for this reason that I told you, is that people have found that these mushrooms can help people with treatment-resistant depression, with trauma, with bipolar disorder, whereas other lines of treatment have failed. We might see some potential in these fungi. And people who also are prone to psychosis, like someone who is schizophrenic or prone to schizophrenia, they might also not tolerate these mushrooms well. So that's one disadvantage to consider. But other than that, the psilocybin mushrooms are quite safe. So this is from a study they did on different psychoactive substances or drugs. We see that the biggest killer obviously is alcohol. And alcohol and tobacco, even though these are legal, they continue to kill the most people and are the most addictive drugs. Mushrooms are non-addictive and they are quite safe. In fact, people use mushrooms to cure people from addiction to alcohol or addiction to heroin or other kind of dangerous drugs. So there is a lot of clinical research being done on this, but what it suggests is that a single mushroom trip can help an addict recover from their addiction to alcohol or their addiction to tobacco or other more dangerous drugs. And through their one mushroom experience, they can use that to effectively treat their addiction. Obviously, this is not a foolproof method. And since these mushrooms have remained illegal for so long, we do not know what the full effects are. But hopefully, as they continue to become legal in parts of Canada and the parts of the United States, we will see more therapeutic effects coming from these mushrooms, right? So just wrapping up, what did we see today? So we just discovered, we had a broad overview of what mushrooms and what fungi are. We saw what mycelium is. We saw the basic different methods of the life cycle of the mushroom, how you can grow mushrooms at home. Then I basically showed you how to take some pictures of mushrooms for identification. And finally, we saw the medical uses of different kinds of mushrooms. That concludes my presentation. And that's all I have to say for now. And thank you.
When you said that these mushrooms are not legal, you meant that these are not legal for doctors to prescribe them as medicines, right?
They're not legal in the same way that they're considered an illegal drug. So in the 1971, there was a convention on psychotropic substances when the United States was starting the war on drugs. So in 1971, the United Nations passed this resolution called the Convention on Psychotropic Substances. On that convention, psilocybin is listed as a drug which has no medical use. That's why it's illegal in most parts of the world. Pakistan is a signatory to that convention. It has not ratified it, so there's no law specifically which says mushrooms are illegal, but they are generally perceived of as a drug. So that's why it's hard to find them, but slowly in more parts of the world they're becoming legal. In the wild, you can usually find them growing on the scat of different species. So they grow from the poop of cows and goats and other animals. So if you go to any bakra mandi or places where you find these animals, you can sometimes find these mushrooms growing in the wild on their poop. It's not recommended to do that again, because if you're eating some other mushroom, that might cause some kind of toxic reaction and you might die.
I don't know how good is this question, but asking, for example, you go to the wild, you don't have your phone and all that to take pictures and share it on the Facebook group to identify the mushroom. So how can you tell whether the mushroom is poisonous or not without Any help?
It's recommended if you are going foraging for mushrooms, you take someone who is experienced in foraging and you take them with you for identification. If you do not have such a person who has been trained in identifying mushrooms, it's not recommended that you eat any mushroom you find in the wild. What you can do in that case is just take your phone with you, take a picture of any mushroom you find, and then post it online, post it to a mushroom identification group on Facebook, and wait until you have a positive ID on that mushroom. Only then it's recommended to eat it, because otherwise you do not know what you're dealing with. So the best answer to your question is basically take someone with you who is experienced and they know what they're doing.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Thank you for the presentation. You talked about how the transfer of a culture into the substrate. Could you just explain a bit more how that happens? How do you transfer the mycelium culture into the substrate?
So that's the second last step, usually in the life cycle of growing mushrooms. So once you have a fully colonized grain jar, let's say I have a bajra which the mycelium has fully eaten, and I have my substrate. I have a coconut coir, let's say. Coconut coir is coconut soil. It's a commonly used substrate. So what you have to do is you just mix the grain with the substrate. In this step, you don't have to do anything else in your still air box. Once the mycelium has fully colonized, everything is clean, and the only thing that's left to do for you is to take the substrate and the grain spawn and then mix it. So you just mix it manually, like you take a small piece of mycelium and then you can mix the spawn, you mix it in the soil, and then you get the mushrooms.
That's a very nice lecture.
Thank you.
So is the mycelium growth always white in the agar? Is
The
that
mycelium
like
growth
universal?
usually is white. This presents a problem for a lot of us because when you're starting out, you don't know what's mycelium, what's mold. There's a lot of mold mycelium which also looks white, and you don't know if this is the mycelium of the mushroom I'm growing or this is some mold. The only way to get past that is some experience. But luckily, there are a lot of groups online on Facebook, on YouTube, where you can find other mushroom growers. You can ask them that, is this the mycelium that I'm trying to grow? Through some experience, you can usually tell the mycelium is usually white. There are some mycelium species like the ghost mushroom, which glows in the dark. It's bioluminescent, so it looks greenish while glowing. But most mycelium mushrooms are white, most of them.
So one more thing, I noticed a mistake in one of your slides when you showed like that fungi and animals had a common ancestor. You wrote 1.6 million years. Na? So that's not accurate. It's more like 1.6 billion years.
Billion.
Because
1.6
1.6 million years is like when apes had already evolved. So we can't have common
Thank you
ancestor.
for the correction. I got confused while writing that, but yes, I did meant to say billion. So it was 1.4 billion, not million. Thank you.
One more question. What's your opinion on the stoned ape hypothesis put forth by Terence McKenna regarding the evolution of intelligence with the help of mushrooms?
So it's an interesting hypothesis. The stoned ape hypothesis, for anyone who doesn't know, is a hypothesis that what caused the evolution of the human brain and what caused the development of the language was that the human beings would consume these psilocybe mushrooms in the wild before there was any society. And consuming these mushrooms is what allowed us to develop language and culture. And it made our brains multiply and double in growth in a period of 150,000 years, right? So that's the hypothesis. I think it does have some kind of, there's some evidence to suggest it's true. One of the biggest evidence is that in psilocybe mushrooms, there's an effect called glossolalia, or speaking in tongues. So what happens is that people who consume these mushrooms in high doses, they can spontaneously start speaking in nonsense or gibberish. So people say that this effect is what caused language to evolve. Obviously, there's no way to prove this for a fact, but we do know that the stoned ape might have been one of the factors that caused language to develop. There were also other factors, obviously, the development of fire, the using of tools, which also helped double our brain growth rate. But yes, that the consumption of psilocybe mushrooms could be one factor. We don't know the full extent of it right now, though.
Okay, that was a perfect segue to my question, actually, which I'm going to keep much simpler than that. Would it be accurate to say that the mycelium of a mushroom is like the brain of a human being or an animal?
Yes, it is, except in the case, the brain is not a single-celled organ, obviously. The brain is a multi-celled organ. But the mycelium is like the brain of the fungus. It's just a single-cell organism, but even that single cell can have remarkable intelligence. And yeah, it is the brain, but it's not the brain like we think of a human brain. But the mycelium is in fact the one which is doing all the decisions for the organism and helping it grow. And it's just one cell, it's a single cell.
Interesting. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Sir, is mycelium formed on food in every season?
Is it form? Sorry, can you repeat?
Is mycelium formed on food in every season? Winter, summer?
Yes, every season. Because all around you, even right now, there are billions of mold spores of different kinds of molds. So even you can try this at home. Just take a piece of bread. If you leave that piece of bread outside for 4 or 5 days, it will still go bad. There will be some mold or some fungus that will grow on it. The only difference is that there is an optimum growing range. So in warmer temperatures, it tends to grow faster. In colder temperatures, it grows slower. It doesn't completely die off, but it slows in growth. So maybe you can say that in warm days, if it takes 5 days for food to spoil, in a colder days, it will take maybe 7 or 8 days. It will still be there, but the growth will be slow. That is the only difference.
So one more question. Sir, can we make any types of mushroom in an artificial way?
You can grow any type of mushroom. You can grow any type of mycelium. There are some limitations. For example, this mushroom that I talked about, Amanita muscaria, it's impossible to grow at home because to grow this mushroom grows in the wild with the pine trees. So unless you have a pine tree and you have the ecosystem of that tree, this mushroom will not be able to grow. Some other mushrooms have a symbiotic relationship with a tree, so you cannot grow them at home some easily. But a lot of mushroom species, edible mushrooms, there are methods that you can grow them at home. So if you know a technique of growing one mushroom species, you can grow almost any mushroom species. It's just the basic agar work and microculture work that you have to know. And you can use that to grow all species of mushrooms.
Is there any time limitation of fungus growth?
Yes, so it depends on the kind of fungus you're trying to grow. So the oyster mushroom, usually its entire life cycle, it takes about 1 month. So if you have, if you start it from a piece of tissue, in 1 month you can get the grain spawn, and then you have what's called a fruiting period. So once the substrate is fully colonized, you will say that it will be 1 month. In this 1 month, the mushroom will keep growing. It grows in something which is called a flush. So a flush is basically a batch. In the fruiting period, let's say if it has a fruiting period of 1 month, I will get 1 flush, 1 batch of mushrooms. I harvest that, then I get another flush. It keeps on growing from that. But you will notice that after maybe 1 month, or 1 month is an arbitrary figure, after 4 or 5 flushes, the mushrooms stop producing that much. And that's when we say that it's time to throw it away and start again from a different fruiting block. Usually though, in commercial mushroom production, people only wait until 2 or 3 flushes and then they throw it away. Because the later flushes, the later batches are much slower. So after one harvest, the next harvest will be more slow, it will be more slow. So after some time, it will be very slow, it's not sustainable, then you just throw away the entire and you start again from scratch.
Okay, one more question. How are we going to differentiate between the eatable mushroom or not eatable mushroom?
That's a very good question. I think it reminds me of this great joke. So the joke goes that all mushroom species are edible. Some are only edible once. So humans have been eating mushrooms, thankfully, for thousands of years. And by now that we have a knowledge that we know basically these mushrooms are edible and these are poisonous, the way we do that is through identification. We need a proper identification, and you know 100% that this is the mushroom species that I'm trying to eat. Only then you can eat that. Mycologists are the scientists who study these mushrooms. They are trained specifically in the identification, and they know that this mushroom species is toxic or this is not. So for a normal person to have that knowledge, they need specialized training. Otherwise, they won't be able to tell using just by the naked eye, okay, this is this mushroom or this is that mushroom. So the mycologists are the one who do the identification. A mycologist is the scientist who studies a mushroom, just like a biologist studies biology or physicist studies physics. We have mycologists and they study mushrooms.
Okay, one last question.
Yes.
One last question. Why the mycelium and fungus start to grow when body is destroyed or when food is wasted?
When they grow, man?
Yeah.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
मैं ये पूछना चाह रहा हूँ कि कोई बॉडी जब डिस्ट्रॉय होता है तभी फंगस ग्रो करना स्टार्ट करता है?
Not always. So you have different kind of species. A lot of fungi are basically, they are decomposers. They break down already dead species like dead matter, dead animals, dead logs. But some of them can grow on live things as well. So it depends on the mushroom species. There are mushroom species like I showed you the Cordyceps mushroom, which turned the ant into or the spider in the zombie. That starts growing when the creature is still living. It can grow inside a living creature and turn that creature into a dead one. So it depends on the mushroom species. Some of the mushroom species, most of them usually grow on dead matter like decaying logs or animal feces, but not all of them. Some of them can still grow on live things. It depends entirely on the mushroom species you're looking at.
Thank you very much for this very nice, lecture once again. I would like to know about the optimal conditions. Like this was very fascinating, and I would love to grow some of them. But it's winter, so what are the optimal temperatures? And can I grow the same like mushrooms in any part of Pakistan if I go back to Gilead and I want to grow them in the cold environment? So
yeah.
please.
So it again depends on the kind of mushroom you're growing. The most common mushrooms you see farmed are button mushrooms, the ones you eat on pizza, or the oyster mushrooms, the ones that I showed you. So for oyster mushrooms, the growing conditions are that you need a bit cold temperatures, like the outside temperature should be 15 to 20 degrees, that's when they fruit. So the oyster mushrooms mostly grow in winters or falls, they don't usually grow in summers. In summers, when it's very hot, especially in a place like Karachi, you won't be able to grow the oyster mushroom that easily. Or in Karachi, it's very hard to grow what's the lion's mane mushroom. It also needs a colder climate. So it depends entirely on the climate, but there are some species, like there's a puffball mushroom, which I think is called khumbi in Urdu. That will only grow in a hot and humid climate. It won't grow in a cold climate. So again, if you are interested, just look up the species you want to grow, and the growing conditions will be dependent on that species. I think the best way that if you want to start at home is just go online and you buy what's called a grow kit. So in the grow kit, all of the work is already done for you. Somebody has already isolated the mycelium. The mycelium has eaten all the grain is mixed with the substrate. Everything is done. The only thing that's left for you is to put it into fruiting conditions and you can grow the mushrooms. So you can buy the grow kits for oyster mushrooms online. They're not that expensive. They cost maybe 1,000 rupees, 2,000 rupees for a small grow kit. And from that grow kit, you can get quite a lot of mushrooms, maybe up till 500 grams, 1 kilo or something you can get from a small grow kit. So that's the easiest way you can start. The more technical way was the one I showed you, in which you use a stiller box and you do all of that agar and microculture work. But the easiest way is to use a grow kit. The grow kit already has the colonized spawn. So in this weather, again, you can grow an oyster mushroom right now. It's fresh oyster mushroom season. Even if you go to Itwar Bazaar, the Sunday market, you will find a lot of king oyster, white oyster mushrooms being sold. So it's the season for that. But when it gets hot, when it's the summer months, you won't see the oyster mushrooms anymore.
And I would like to also know about what are the precautions or immediate medical actions that one should take in a case when someone ingests by mistake or
just
do an
you should
experiment.
call poison control. One trick that people say is if you eat any poisonous thing, you should eat raw egg. I don't know if this applies to mushroom, so I'm not a doctor. Please don't, if you are dying from eating toxic mushroom, don't say that Ammar said I have to eat raw egg. So that don't take that advice. But usually when people poison stray dogs, so what they say is you feed them raw egg, kacha anda. That helps take the poisoning away. But if you eat any kind of, or if you know a child who has eaten a poisonous mushroom, try to make them vomit immediately so they can get the mushroom out and then call a hospital. That's your best bet. Again, don't eat any poisonous mushroom that you don't know. Other questions? Yes.
Last.
Yes,
It's not a serious question, but just to, on a lighter note. I'd like to know how to grow the dead man's finger. that would be fun to grow.
I don't think
dead man's finger. There was a mushroom.
I don't think it's possible to grow at home because it needs a special kind of log which is only found in the wild. So some mushroom species like dead man's finger, it's very hard to cultivate them at home. You will only find them in the wild. So I don't think it's possible. Maybe if mushroom farming is advanced enough, you can see in 50 years, humans might be able to grow the species indoors, which we thought is impossible to grow outdoors right now. Maybe. But right now, we're not that technologically advanced in which we can grow these mushroom species to that extent indoors. Because they have a very delicate, climate and environment that they need to grow. And for us to replicate those conditions inside our homes, it's not possible for all mushroom species. It's only possible for some of them. So far. In the future, it might be possible. Okay, thank you so much. I had a lot of fun.